History doesn't always erase women with violence. Sometimes it erases them with silence. These women organized movements, carried communities, and challenged power, not for recognition, but because it needed to be done. Their names were pushed aside, their work was minimized, and their impact was never meant to be remembered. Tonight, we bring their voices back. Welcome to Whispers of the Taken. Tonight, we're doing something different. This isn't a story about death. It's a story about silence, about women whose voices were pushed aside, not because they lacked power, but because they carried too much of it. Women who organized movements, challenged systems, held communities together, and reshaped history, often without recognition, protection, or permission. Their names were minimized, their contributions were erased, and their leadership was quietly treated as a threat. This is not history as you were taught it. This is what happens when women become impossible to ignore. The architects we were never meant to see. History has a way of teaching us names, but rarely the whole truth. When we speak of movements, revolutions, resistance, and change, we are often handed a version of the story that centers men. Loud voices, raised fists, martyrs whose deaths are framed as endings. But beneath every movement that ever threatened power, there were women, organizing, educating, protecting, strategizing, and holding communities together long after the cameras left. And many of them were taken from us too soon, not always by a bullet, sometimes by prison, sometimes by exile, sometimes by character assassination so effective that the world never heard them clearly again. These women were not supporting characters. They were the backbone. This is not an exhaustive list. These are the women I was taught about or had to search for myself in my time. And once you see them clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee how intentionally their stories were buried. Elaine Brown, power was never meant to look like her. Elaine Brown did something history still struggles to process. She led, not symbolically, not temporarily. She became chairwoman of the Black Panther Party at a time when the organization was under intense surveillance, infiltration, and internal fracture. She stepped into leadership during chaos, and instead of collapsing, she stabilized it. Brown pushed community programs forward, free breakfast programs, liberation schools, housing initiatives. She believed revolution wasn't only about resistance, it was about building systems that proved another world was possible. But leadership came at a cost. She faced misogyny from within the movement and relentless pressure from outside it. Her authority was constantly questioned, not because she failed, but because power wrapped in a woman's body was threatening in a way few men ever had to endure. Elaine Brown wasn't assassinated, she was isolated, discredited, pushed out of the story, and in many ways that erasure is just as effective as violence. Assata Shakur, when survival itself becomes a crime. Assata Shakur's name still makes institutions uncomfortable because she didn't disappear. She survived. A former member of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army, Assata was targeted relentlessly by COINTELPRO-era law enforcement, arrested repeatedly, monitored constantly, tried in a courtroom that seemed to decide her guilt before she ever spoke. In 1973, she was shot and captured. Later convicted under circumstances that remained deeply contested, she became a symbol, not of violence, but of how the state treats women who refuse to submit. Her eventual escape from prison and asylum in Cuba turned her into something the government hates most, a living contradiction. They wanted a cautionary tale. They got a survivor. To this day, she remains labeled a terrorist, not because of what she did, but because of what she represents, resistance that could not be erased. Kathleen Cleaver, the woman who controlled the narrative. Revolutions don't survive without messaging. Kathleen Cleaver understood that power doesn't only live in weapons or protests, it lives in language, media, and public perception. As Communications Secretary for the Black Panther Party, Cleaver shaped how the movement spoke to the world. She challenged distortions, confronted lies, and forced America to see what it wanted to ignore. She was young, brilliant, unapologetic, and because of that, she was watched, followed, and pushed into exile. Cleaver didn't just advocate for liberation. She explained it, which made her dangerous in a way that silence never could. And yet her role is often minimized, reduced to proximity, reduced to association. History rarely forgives women who speak too clearly. Angela Davis, intellectual freedom is the most dangerous kind. Angela Davis terrified the establishment, not because she carried a gun, but because she carried ideas. A philosopher, professor, and activist, Davis exposed the machinery of mass incarceration, racial capitalism, and state violence long before these conversations became mainstream. She was placed on the FBI's most wanted list, arrested, tried, and ultimately acquitted. But the damage was already done. They tried to make an example of her, to warn others what happens when a woman refuses to stay within the boundaries assigned to her. Angela Davis wasn't taken too soon in death, but she was nearly erased in life. And the fact that she endured is not proof of mercy, it is proof of resilience. If you're enjoying the video so far, please take a second to like and subscribe. It's a huge help to the channel. Thank you. Now back to the story. Ericka Huggins. Healing as an act of resistance. Ericka Huggins is rarely spoken about, and that silence is intentional. A leader within the Black Panther Party, Huggins endured unimaginable loss, including the assassination of her husband. Instead of retreating, she leaned into education, healing, and spiritual grounding. She helped run liberation schools and focused on emotional and psychological health within the movement, an aspect of revolution that history often ignores. But healing threatens power too, because healed people are harder to control. Her imprisonment, surveillance, and marginalization weren't accidents. They were strategies. Ella Baker, the woman who built leaders instead of crowns. Ella Baker may be the most important name on this list and the least recognized. She didn't seek the spotlight. She built the infrastructure. Baker believed strong movements don't need strong men. They need strong communities. She mentored young activists, helped form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and rejected hierarchical leadership models that centered ego over people. Her philosophy was radical. Strong people don't need strong leaders. That idea alone threatened every power structure built on control. Ella Baker wasn't assassinated, but she was sidelined, overshadowed, written out of simplified history. And yet nearly every successful movement that followed carried her fingerprints. Why this hurts in a different way. What makes this pain cut deeper is not just that these women were targeted, it's that they were necessary. They were the organizers, the teachers, the healers, the strategists. They were the ones who stayed when cameras left, who fed children, who educated minds, who held movements together when men were imprisoned or killed. And still, history found ways to shrink them, to call them radicals, to call them dangerous, to call them unimportant, or worse, nothing at all. The pattern we're not supposed to acknowledge. When women rise with clarity, independence, and influence, especially women of color, the response is rarely debate. It is surveillance, criminalization, isolation, erasure, not always assassination, but something quieter and just as effective. A slow removal from the narrative, a reframing of their courage as danger, a rewriting of their leadership as extremism. And over time, the absence becomes normal. New generations grow up without their names, without their lessons, without knowing who built the foundations they now stand on. Because dead leaders can inspire, but erased leaders can't. What they left us anyway. Despite everything, these women left us blueprints. They showed us that leadership doesn't always shout, that revolution can look like care, that unity doesn't require sameness, that courage can exist without permission. They taught us how to build quietly in the spaces power forgets to watch, how to organize without needing a spotlight, how to protect communities while imagining something better beyond survival. Their work wasn't about legacy, it was about continuity. And most importantly, they showed us that the future was never stolen, it was interrupted. These women were taken from us too soon, not always in body, but in voice, visibility, and truth. Their stories weren't simply ended. They were softened, trimmed down, reframed until their power felt smaller than it truly was. Pushed to the margins of history books and public memory, And they are not the only ones. There are countless women, many more than could ever fit into a single story, who organized, resisted, healed, built, and changed the course of history in ways we are still benefiting from today. The women named here are not meant to stand alone. They are women I was taught about or discovered at different points in my life. Entry points into a much larger, unfinished truth. And maybe that was the point. Because if we truly understood how much of our world was shaped by women like these, how much organizing, vision, and sacrifice existed outside the spotlight, we might start asking dangerous questions. Questions about who gets remembered, who gets erased, and who has the power to decide which stories survive. At Whispers of the Taken, we listen for the voices history tried to quiet, not to reopen wounds, but to honor truth, to remember that silence is rarely accidental, and forgetting is often taught. And maybe that, remembering anyway, is the most threatening legacy of all. Thank you for staying with us until the end. These stories deserve to be remembered and told with care. If this episode moved you, please consider hitting like and subscribing. It's a small action that helps keep these voices from fading into silence. Until next time, listen closely. The whispers are never truly gone.